Why hello my intrinsically valuable fellow apes, I hope you're well. Welcome to what is, at long last, the final segment in the infinite debate between myself and Cameron Bertuzzi of Capturing Christianity. Let's just get straight to it. From the outset of this debate, Cameron has predicated his first premise, that there is a first cause, on causal finitism, the thesis that every event or state has a finite causal history, or in other words, that there cannot be infinitely many causes affecting one target state, be it directly or indirectly. Also from the outset, I have been bringing attention to the fact that, within his opening, Cameron used singular language throughout his defense of his second premise, thus implying that causal finitism, his first premise, gets us to a singular first cause, when Alexander Pruss and Robert Kuhn's, to name just two foremost proponents, have made it abundantly clear that it doesn't. Given this, I've emphasised that Cameron either needs to provide an additional argument to get us from the plural to the singular, or he ought to update his conclusion of God exists to at least one God exists. Without this clarification, without this precision, Cam's Kalaam has serious linguistic issues, at least as far as I'm convinced. To give just one instance, consider the following example, taken from his opening.
But this directly implies that since it's wholly uncaused, the first cause has no limits. And an unlimited nature implies a perfect nature. Hence, a perfect being exists. Hence, God exists.
May I ask if you, the viewer, got the impression that by the first cause, an unlimited nature, a perfect nature, or a perfect being, that Cameron was speaking in the potentially plural? I for one didn't, and thus I urged, and I still urge Cameron to alter his language. Now, since Cameron dedicated less than a minute to this crucial exchange in his closing, I'm going to be as terse as I comfortably can. In his first rebuttal, Cameron responded by stating that my objection is actually in relation to his second premise.
However, this is actually an objection to my second premise that identifies the first cause as God.
But then in his second rebuttal, he stated that my objection isn't of any of his premises, and therefore can be dismissed.
As I've thought about it, however, I realized that I was actually wrong here. Stephen's second objection doesn't target my second premise. So, interestingly, this objection targets no premise in any of my arguments.
Further still, he argued that his first premise is consistent with the existential quantifier, which he bolstered with a sheep analogy. In response, I emphasised that his first premise is also consistent with the uniqueness quantifier, and that his sheep analogy is not consistent with his language, as we've just seen. In other words, his seventh premise has serious ambiguity issues. Finally, here's what Cameron had to say in his conclusion.
Despite Stephen's initial impression of my opening statement, I clarified in my most recent response that by there is a first cause, I did not intend that to mean there is a single first cause. This clarification honestly just completely puts this objection to bed. So that's it, it's done.
I respectfully disagree. Putting this objection to bed would mean updating the language to reflect the potential plurality. Look, throughout the entirety of this debate, Cameron has significantly emphasised the importance of clarification and precision, and yet he hasn't, at least as far as I'm convinced, practiced what he preaches.
Is that I hope that it will convince Stephen to be a little bit more precise in the future. I think that he and I can both agree that precision is very, very important when it comes to these kinds of conversations. But then I could also use that to help encourage Stephen to be a little bit more precise in our debate.
In defense of Cameron's first premise, that there is a first cause, he provides premises 4 through 8, which state:
Premise 4. The Grim Reaper scenario is impossible. Premise 5. If the Grim Reaper scenario is impossible, then causal finitism is true. So it follows causal finitism is true from premises 4 and 5. Premise 7. If causal finitism is true, then there is a first cause. So it follows there is a first cause from 6 in premise 7.
And in his closing, Cameron took us back to the very beginning of our exchange, covering all the objections I've levied and all of his responses. And we'll do the same.
Stephen began this debate offering 3 different objections to the Grim Reaper paradox. First, he argued that the Grim Reaper paradox involves a beginning and thus doesn't apply to an infinite past. Second, he argued that causal finitism does not imply a single first cause. Third, he argued that
even if it is the case that certain kinds of large and small denurable physical infinities are impossible, it does not follow that therefore all kinds of large and small denurable physical infinities are impossible.
In my second rebuttal, I explained how all three of Stephen's initial objections fall into the same category. They target no premise in any of my arguments. While Stephen had other things to say about my second rebuttal, he didn't actually rebut this point. This is actually super important. If Stephen's initial three objections don't target any premises in my arguments, then they're completely off the table.
Alright, let's take the time to unpack this, beginning with my first objection. Within the same sentence of the quote that Cameron just gave, I said the following: "But in order to apply the argument to the universe itself, Cameron must be assuming a starting point within an infinite past, which is not possible. There is no beginning in an infinite past, and without a beginning there is no paradox." Indeed, in the Grim Reaper paradox, we select a beginning and an end of a segment of time, such as between 12 and 1, and then divide the segment an infinite number of times, assigning a Reaper to each point of division. So, if we suppose for a moment that the scenario demonstrates that it's impossible to have an infinite causal chain within a finite segment of time, a time that explicitly has a beginning and an end for us to divide, does it follow that it's impossible to have an infinite causal chain spread across an infinite extent of time, a time that does not have a beginning? Well, I argued that it doesn't. Thus my saying, Cameron needs to produce the contradiction in reference to an infinite past, as opposed to producing a contradiction in reference to a finite past. This, then, is obviously an objection to premise 5. The Grim Reaper scenario could be impossible without causal finitism being true. It could be the case that we can't have infinite causal chains within a finite segment of time, but it doesn't follow that we can't have an infinite causal chain spread out over an infinite extent of time. Moving on, my second objection, that causal finitism does not imply a single first cause, can be taken two ways. Either one as an objection of the ambiguity of premise 7, or indeed as an objection of Cameron effectively missing a premise to get us from the plural to the singular. Now, the reason I express this here and not elsewhere is because, as I explained a few moments ago, Cameron used singular language throughout his defense of his second premise, thus implying that causal finitism gets us to a singular first cause. And finally, let's consider my third objection, by listening to the paragraph I gave shortly after the sentence that Cameron quoted. "One cannot argue from the mere fact that one has described an inconsistent scenario involving the occurrence of large and small denurable physical infinities to the conclusion that it is impossible for there to be large and small denurable physical infinities. At the very least, one has to be able to show that the inconsistency arises only because of the presence of large and small denurable physical infinities." This objection, again, was and is targeted at Cameron's fifth premise. It expresses that Cameron must demonstrate that the inconsistency arises only because of the presence of denumerable infinites. After all, the inconsistency could be simply due, for instance, to the paradox consisting of a proposition and a rule that are mutually unsatisfiable. This would mean that the Grim Reaper paradox is impossible without it following that causal finitism is true. So when Cameron says that none of my original three objections target any of his premises, he's just wrong. Now, in hindsight, I appreciate that I could have explicitly stated which premise each of my objections are targeting, but to be honest, I think it's really obvious which they're targeting. I mean, did Cameron think I was just talking about irrelevant stuff and that no one was calling me out on it or something? I don't know, but in any case, he's wrong to say that none of my objections target any of his premises. They do.
In his second video, Stephen alleged that I abandon the Grim Reaper paradox.
In his opening, he presented the goalposts of the Grim Reaper paradox, and once I had taken a shot, once I had provided objections, he abandoned the goalpost for a new set, the Grim Messenger paradox.
In my second rebuttal, I explained that this is based on a misunderstanding. I didn't abandon the Grim Reaper paradox, I actually defended it.
So, as just discussed, the Grim Reaper paradox consists of an infinite causal chain within a finite segment of time, whereas the Grim Messenger paradox consists of an infinite causal chain spread out over an infinite extent of time. Thus, the objection I levied at the Grim Reaper argument, that it doesn't apply to an infinite past, can't be levied at the Grim Messenger argument, as Cameron rightfully boasted.
This new version of the paradox, the Grim Messenger paradox, obviously does apply to an infinite past and does imply a first cause.
But if the objection can be targeted at one argument, but not the other, then it stands to reason that they're not the same argument. Further still, notice that this isn't some trivial difference, wherein one argument has blue reapers and the other has red. No, this is a major difference. Both arguments share similarities, no doubt, but the fact that one features an infinite causal chain spread out over an infinite extent of time, that is, the very thing that Cameron is trying to disprove the existence of, whereas the other doesn't feature an infinite temporal history, is the very reason that my objection applies to one, but not the other.
Stephen then offered two new objections to the Grimm messenger version of my argument for causal finitism. First, he argued that assigning natural numbers to all of the messengers is impossible because a potential infinite prohibits this. I made three different replies. First, I argued that the messenger scenario doesn't actually involve a potential infinite.
Yeah, I definitely think I could have done a better job of conveying my objection here. That's fair. What I was trying to communicate, and what I touched upon after misspeaking, is that, instead of this year's messenger being assigned number 1, last year's being assigned number 2, and so on, tell me the number assigned to this year's messenger given a potential infinite of assigned messengers before it. You can't. This is to say that since the scenario assumes a set with no first member, that is, an infinite temporal history, it follows that there is no first messenger to predicate subsequent messengers on. In essence, the first member of the set is assigned the largest natural number, but there is no largest natural number, and this fact is more obvious when we attempt to flip the messengers. And it's worth pointing out that this objection actually applies to both the Grim Reaper and Grim Messenger paradoxes, since they are both effectively asking, what is the largest natural number?
Second, I explained that the order of the messengers can't be reversed for the very same reason that the ascending order of all natural numbers can't be reversed.
This was, in fact, my point. The natural numbers can't be flipped because there is no largest natural number. The scenario guyfully disguises this fact by assigning the first natural number to the last messenger's actions. But, since the last messenger is predicated on the second to last messenger, and so on, in a set that has no first member, we get the contradiction. I expanded on this greatly when presenting the unsatisfiable pair diagnosis, which I'll again touch upon shortly.
Third, I argued that the messengers could simply be assigned with unique symbols as opposed to numbers.
But the natural numbers are symbols. Each number symbolizes a quantity or ordering. The fact that we can't ask what is the largest symbol in a set that has no largest symbol is the point. That's what the Grim Reaper, Grim Messenger, and indeed all Bernadette paradoxes are effectively asking us to do.
His second objection to the messenger paradox was that it was question-begging. According to Stephen,
it's begging the question, since it assumes a first state, the initial condition of a blank message, in order to prove that there must have been a first state.
In reply, I argued that the messenger paradox actually assumes the opposite. It assumes that there is no first state.
Again, I freely admit that I could have communicated my point better here. I'll take that. Fair enough. The point, however, is that while Cameron is correct to say that the set with no first member assumes a first state, the if and only if rule does assume that there's a first state, for action or inaction, and this is precisely why the proposition and the rule can't be jointly satisfied. Thus, the rule is assuming the very thing that Cameron is trying to prove, a first state.
Just a heads up, we're about to get really deep into the weeds. Really deep. So just get your mind right. So unlike his previous objections that targeted no premises in my arguments,
you know what? Since Cameron has been reprimanding me in reference to philosophy and precision, etc., let me reply in kind. Cameron, when you get an objection that doesn't seem to immediately target a premise, take the time to reflect on which premise it could be targeting. Further still, recognise that objections don't actually have to target a premise. They could instead target an implicit or suppressed premise, or the fact that throughout an argument a word or term is ambiguous. Anyhow, and again, two of my previous objections rather obviously targeted premise 5.
This one does target a very specific premise, premise 5. I'll pull my full supporting argument back up on the screen so that you can see it in its full context. In defense of premise 5, if you recall from my opening statement, I basically argued that the best explanation why the Grim Reaper story is impossible is because causal finitism is true. Stephen purports to have found a better solution to the paradox than causal finitism. According to Stephen, all that we need to say about Bernadette scenarios like the Grim Reaper paradox is that they start in logical inconsistency. They involve a jointly unsatisfiable pair of propositions. In other words, we just simply sort of recognize that these stories, the Grim Reaper story, the Grim Messenger story, they just simply involve contradictory propositions. And so we don't need to posit some kind of extra metaphysical thesis or hypothesis like causal finitism. We just simply recognize that these stories are contradictory, and that's it. Moreover, not only does Unsatisfiable Pair resolve paradoxes like the Grim Reaper paradox, the Grim Messenger paradox, it resolves similar semantic paradoxes like Yablo's paradox, talking about a lot of paradoxes right now. It resolves other paradoxes, and it has less ontological commitments. I mean, when you think about it in these terms, it's like, why? Yeah, Unsatisfiable Pair is a great objection. It's a great alternative to causal finitism. Reverse card, reverse card, reverse card, reverse card. There it is. So I'm a huge fan of introducing reverse cards in debates, and that's what I'm about to do. Far, far, far away from being a reason to abandon causal finitism, Unsatisfiable Pair is a great reason to embrace causal finitism.
Okay, before we get to Cameron's reverse card, let's have a bit more of a refresher of Dr. Nicholas Schackel's Unsatisfiable Pair diagnosis. In his paper titled The Form of the Benedetti Dichotomy, Schackel strips several Benedetti paradoxes off their garb as to reveal the logical framework that they all share, which consists simply of a proposition and a rule. The proposition is a set with no first member, and the rule is that for each member of the set, a property holds, that is, something will happen, if and only if that property doesn't hold for the prior member, which by extension means all prior members. Now, Benedetti's original paradox, which is the one that Schackel opens with in his paper, and indeed the one that Dr. Graham Oppy addresses in his book, is set up, in Benedetti's words no less, as follows. A man decides to walk 1 mile from A to B. A god waits in readiness to throw up a wall blocking the man's further advance when the man has travelled half a mile. A second god, unknown to the first, waits in readiness to throw up a wall of his own blocking the man's further advance when the man has travelled 1/4 of a mile. A third god, etc. ad infinitum. With this setup, we get an explicit contradiction.
Thus, we've arrived at an explicit contradiction.
A wall stops the man, and a wall doesn't stop the man.
Fred is dead, and Fred is not dead.
Now, in this case, the set with no first member is dressed up in the garb of a finite distance of space, whereas in the Grim Reaper paradox, the set is dressed up in the garb of a finite segment of time, and in the Grim Messenger paradox, the set is dressed up in the garb of an infinite extent of time. But what Schackel superbly illustrates in his paper, which I spelt out in full in my last rebuttal, is that the garb, be it spatial, temporal, causal, or whatever, is completely and utterly irrelevant, since the contradiction occurs without any garb whatsoever. The logical schematic pair, that is, the proposition and the rule, simply can't be jointly satisfied. Or to put it another way, Benedetti predicates the execution of intentions on the non-execution of prior intentions where there is no first time or place for action or inaction. The rule is therefore simply incompatible with sets that have no first member. It's that simple, and the mistake that Cameron and other Kalaam proponents make is that they blame the unbegun set for the contradiction, which they dress up in the garb of causal chains. Alright, that's the UPD. With that, let's hear Cameron's reverse card.
Okay, so here is the argument. It's actually pretty simple. If causal finitism is false, then the Grim Messenger story is possible. However, we know from Unsatisfiable Pair that Grim Messenger stories are impossible. And then it follows that causal finitism is true.
Let's pause here for a moment and highlight the exchange so far. The reason for this is because, as Cameron put it, we're about to get really deep into the weeds. Up until this point, Cameron has been arguing that the reason that the Grim Messenger scenario is impossible is because causal finitism is true. That is, that the scenario is impossible specifically because it consists of an infinite causal chain. In response, I have exposed the fact that Schackel has clearly demonstrated that the causal chain is just fluff, it's just a garb. The contradiction doesn't occur due to the presence of an infinite causal chain, but rather simply because the scenario consists of a proposition and a rule that are jointly unsatisfiable, hence the unsatisfiable pair diagnosis. And now, in his closing, Cameron is insisting that if the scenario is impossible for any reason whatsoever, then causal finitism is true. That's not a reverse card, my friends. That's an ignore the better solution card. To illustrate this, let's arrange Cameron's text into a syllogism. Notice that the first premise, premise 21, claims that if the Grim Messenger scenario is impossible for any reason whatsoever, then causal finitism is true. This can be more easily recognised in its contrapositive form, which is, if the Grim Messenger scenario is impossible, then causal finitism is true. Now, funny enough, this is pretty much exactly the same as his fifth premise, and just as many of my objections have pertained to his fifth premise, so too will many that I'm about to give apply to his 21st premise. Before that, however, let's get into those weeds.
So you might be wondering, why think that if causal finitism is false, then the Grimm messenger story is possible? So let me actually pause a moment and talk about something super exciting: clocks. So I've got a little alarm clock here. Check it, you can actually hear the bell in there. If I were to adjust the alarm on this clock to, say, like 6 a.m., would that therefore adjust any of your clocks in your house? Obviously not. Would setting the alarm like rearrange all the books on my bookshelves? No. Changing this clock's internal features doesn't change the intrinsic features of other objects or like the locations of those objects. From these observations, we can actually derive a fun little philosophical principle about clocks. C. For any possible clocks, changing their intrinsic features does not necessarily change the intrinsic features of any other object. In the literature, this kind of principle is known as a rearrangement or recombination principle.
And it's also known as David Lewis's patchwork principle. Now, Cameron goes on to apply this principle to the Grimm messenger scenario, but before we get to him doing so, I just want to provide two reasons to suspect that the principle is false. Switch card, switch card, switch card, there it is. Evidently, Cameron is fond of reverse cards, and so I'm pretty sure that he'll enjoy a switch card too. In his first rebuttal, Cameron featured Joe Schmid talking about scientism, and I'm now going to feature Schmid's recently published criticism of Cameron's principle, which Schmid argues is, quote, by the theist's own light is false, and that the theist's way to avoid this problem will render the argument unsuccessful. In a nutshell, here's Schmid's objection. Suppose for a moment that an omniscient God at the beginning of time forms the belief that in 2021 a particular clock will be set to noon. Per Cameron's principle, we can change the clock's time without changing the intrinsic properties of anything else, including God's belief states, which are, after all, an intrinsic feature of God. But what would this mean? This would mean that the clock isn't set to noon in 2021, and yet God, an all-knowing being, erroneously believed that it would be. That is, an omniscient being was wrong, which is impossible. An omniscient being can't, by definition, have a false belief. This is a violation of omniscience. So, to reiterate, since this contradiction results from the conjunction of theism and C, by the theist's own lights, C is false. Thus, to conclude that there cannot be an infinite causal chain due to this principle is equivalent to concluding that there cannot be an omniscient God according to this principle, and I strongly suspect that Cameron wouldn't endorse the latter. What this tells us, then, is that we simply have to take into account certain global features of reality. For instance, if there's an omniscient being that believes something about the situation, or if a contradiction is predicated on an ordering. To check out Schmid's objection in full, visit the description. It's a great read. I highly recommend it. And as a quick second objection of Cameron's principle, I'm going to borrow a point from James Fodor, who along with Nathan from Digital Gnosis has recently produced a 10-hour critique of the debate between me and Cameron that I highly recommend checking out. It pertains to quantum entanglement, which loosely is a phenomenon that occurs when a group of particles interact in such a way that each particle of the group can't be described independently of the state of the others, including when the particles are separated by a large distance. Now, it stands to reason that if we change the intrinsic clock of one of these particles, then via quantum entanglement, this will necessarily also change the intrinsic features of other entangled particles, which would mean that Cameron's principle is false. Again, check out the description to see Nathan and James unpacking this. Now, chiefly because of these two compelling objections, I reject Cameron's principle. I don't think we can rule out the existence of an omniscient God this easily. So I could wrap up here and be done with it, but that's no fun. Instead, for the sake of argument, let's suppose that the principle is true, that we can change the intrinsic features of something without changing the intrinsic features of other things. Let's see what Cameron does with this principle.
Returning to the Grimm messenger scenario, let's now stipulate that each messenger is installed with an alarm clock. So when their alarm goes off, they act. Alright, let's leave clocks alone for a moment and talk about the arrangement of messengers in the story. The paradox in this story is actually very sensitive to the particular arrangement of activation times. If the messengers aren't arranged in just the right sequence, there's actually no paradox. For example, consider the benign messenger story. In this story, the past is still infinite, in other words, causal finitism is still false, but the activation times for each messenger are set differently, very differently. Grim Messenger's number 1 alarm is set for January 1, 2019 at 12 p.m. Now, even though the past is infinite, there are no alarms set to go off before this one. The remaining alarms for the rest of the infinite set of messengers are all set for January 2nd, 2019, between 12 p.m. and 1 p.m. It doesn't actually matter how the remaining alarms are set to go off on January 2nd. They could all go off randomly during the hour or even all go off simultaneously. The point is that since it has a first member, the benign messenger story is not paradoxical. At 12 p.m. on January 1, 2019, Grim Messenger number 1 writes the number 1 on the message.
Number 1.
On January 2, the rest see the number 1 on the message and do nothing.
Number 1, pass it along.
So in the benign story, the message just has the number 1 written on it. There's no paradox. So earlier when I was setting up my argument, I argued that the falsity of causal finitism leads to the possibility of the Grim Messenger story. Here's how that works. The only difference between the Grim Messenger scenario and the benign messenger scenario is the activation times of the messengers. In both, remember, causal finitism is false. All that's changed is that the alarms for each messenger are different. Literally, that is the only difference between these two scenarios.
Alright, so first and foremost, no, that's not literally the only difference. Another, to give just one example, is that whereas the set in the Grim Messenger paradox is mapped onto an infinite past, in the benign scenario it isn't. In fact, the benign scenario assumes an infinite past for no practical purpose whatsoever. Now, for the sake of clarity, I'd like to emphasize a couple of points. The first is that in order to change the benign scenario into the Grim Messenger paradox, it's necessary to change the intrinsic property, the activation time, of all of the members, not just one. To illustrate this, let's take the benign scenario and change only the intrinsic activation time of messenger number 1. In such a case, we still don't have a paradoxical situation. And the same is true if we change the intrinsic property of any specific member. Rather, to get from the benign scenario to the Grim Messenger scenario, we have to change the intrinsic activation times of all of the members, like this, or like this. Indeed, by changing the intrinsic activation times of all of the members, we can arrange them so that they no longer have a first member for action or inaction. This is the crucial difference. But notice that this isn't an intrinsic feature of the members, but rather an extrinsic fact about the scenario. Each member's ordering in the set isn't an intrinsic feature of the member. No, it's an extrinsic relational fact. However, the rearrangement principle doesn't state that changing the intrinsic properties of something won't necessarily change the extrinsic world, and so we're all good. If we change the intrinsic features of all of the members, we can go from the benign scenario to the Grim Messenger paradox. Now, let's slow down a moment to run through Cameron's reasoning here, because again, we're pretty deep in the weeds. Per his principle, we can change the intrinsic activation times of each member of the benign scenario as to get the Grim Messenger paradox. This is his 18th premise. But since we know that the Grim Messenger scenario is impossible due to the unsatisfiable pair, it follows that the benign scenario is also impossible, since, Cameron argues, the only difference between the two scenarios is the intrinsic features of the members. And here's the crucial step. Since we assumed causal finitism to be false in the benign scenario, we now know that it's impossible for causal finitism to be false, and hence we know that causal finitism is true, as Cameron expressed in his 17th premise. So earlier, I gave two compelling reasons to reject the soundness of premise 18, that being Schmidt's fallible omniscience scenario and Fodor's quantum entanglement objection. But remember, I'm currently assuming that the principle is true, and so let's tentatively grant premise 18. Instead, let's focus on premise 17. Where in the benign scenario is causal finitism assumed to be false? Well, let's ask Cameron.
In both, remember, causal finitism is false.
So, according to Cameron, causal finitism is assumed in the benign scenario by virtue of it featuring an infinite past. But notice that this assumption plays no role in the scenario. That is, the set is not mapped onto the infinite past, and so it's just fluff, a fart in the wind. It's not relevant to the scenario, it's assumed for no functional purpose whatsoever. I mean, even the illusion of it being a vital part of the paradox isn't present. At least the Grim Messenger scenario guyfully pretends that it is, to use Shackle's term. Another switch card there it is. Let's assume that God exists in this scenario. Now, by Cameron's principle, we can change the intrinsic features of the members as to construct the grim messenger paradox, and so, by Cameron's own lights, we have now demonstrated that it's impossible for God to exist.
See, Unsatisfiable Pair and Causal Finitism aren't just friends. They're BFFs. And BFFs always find a way to work things out.
You see, Unsatisfiable Pair and God not existing aren't just friends, they're BFFs, and BFFs always find a way to work things out. Again, and I can't stress this enough, the assumption that God exists is as relevant in the benign scenario that I just set up as is the assumption that the past is infinite in the benign scenario that Cameron set up. If Cameron's benign scenario rules out an infinite past, then my benign scenario rules out God's existence. And I suspect that's not true. Another way to make this point is to simply change the infinite past to the finite past. Per Cameron's principle, we've just proven that the past isn't finite, it's infinite. Or, and this will be my final swing, let's follow Alex Malpass's footsteps and assume for reductio an infinite future, which is a vital assumption made by most Christians. After all, if it's impossible for the future to be eternal, to continue forever, then heaven isn't forever. It's an all-inclusive but finite holiday. Well, given Cameron's principle, we've now proven that it's impossible for there to be an infinite future. Why? Precisely for the same reason that Cameron thinks we can rule out the infinite past. Literally, the only difference is that one assumes an infinite past for no reason, while the other assumes an infinite future for no reason. And as a side note, if you'd like to see Malpass and Schmid discuss the application of causal finitism and Bernadette paradoxes to the future as opposed to the past, then be sure to check out the video in the description. All in all, then, while the likes of Shakel, Malpass, Schmid and myself conclude that Bernadette paradoxes are simply impossible because they consist of a proposition and a rule that are jointly unsatisfiable, Cameron argues that we should not only additionally commit ourselves to the ontologically extremely expensive cost of causal finitism, but also the cost of the rearrangement principle, which by Schmid and my own lights would rule out an omniscient being.
In the third and final section, we'll look at all of the different objections Stephen has raised against my defense of my second premise, see what's come of those objections, and then I'll address his objection that my argument from limits is question-begging. Let's draw together the very last threads of this debate. So as another reminder, here's the way that I defended my second premise in my opening statement.
In regards to Cameron's second premise, that if there is a first cause then God exists, the primary tension has no doubt been on premise 9. That if there is a first cause, then it has no limits. And the argument that Cameron has given to substantiate this premise is his argument from limits, which consists of premise 13 through 16.
I defended premise 9, as you'll recall, with an argument from limits.
Now, there's a relatively significant problem with the structure of this argument that I haven't yet highlighted since I thought doing so would be pedantic. However, this has come back to bite me, and so I'm now forced to bring it to the forefront. Notice that the conclusion of Cameron's argument from limits, that the first cause is not limited, is not verbatim his ninth premise, which is, if there is a first cause, then it has no limits. This is a problem since the very reason Cameron's argument from limits exists at all is as a defense of premise 9. Indeed, if it doesn't substantiate his ninth premise, then it's a complete and utter waste of time, a giant red herring. Because of this, I've operated as if the conclusion of his argument from limits is equivalent to premise 9, as it should be. This, however, as we're about to see, was a mistake.
In his latest response, Stephen claims that my argument from limits is
begging the question via contraposition.
So we'll get to the contraposition part of that in a moment, but let's first kind of see what he's doing here. He reasons that we can replace the word limited with
pretty much anything
and get a result that I won't like. For example, let's replace limited with power. 13 star, anything that has power has a cause. 14 star, if the first cause has power, then it has a cause. 15, same premise I used, the first cause does not have a cause. But then the conclusion, 16 star, follows. The first cause has no power. So here's why, according to Stephen, we can basically give the first cause any property we want it to have.
So why is it that we can plug into Cameron's argument from limits pretty much whatever we want the first cause or first causes to have? The answer is, the argument is begging the question via contraposition. In logic and mathematics, the logically equivalent, the contrapositive, of the form if P then Q, is not Q then not P. Take, for instance, the assertion that all humans, P, were born, Q. The contrapositive of this statement is, anything that was not born, not Q, is not human, not P. Now let's take Cameron's 13th premise, which is his first in his argument from limits, that anything that is limited, P, has a cause, Q. The logical equivalent of this is that anything that does not have a cause, not Q, is not limited, not P. And since this is quite literally the very thing Cameron's trying to prove, his argument from limits is begging the question.
So there's a whole lot to unpack here. First, let me just say that I don't dispute the validity of contraposition. That's not a disagreement between Stephen and I. Where I disagree, and this is my second point, it's false that the contrapositive of my premise 13 is identical to my conclusion. Remember, the conclusion of my argument from limits is that the first cause has no limits. This is not actually logically equivalent to the contrapositive of premise 13. As a quick reminder, here's the contrapositive of 13. 13 star. Anything that does not have a cause is not limited. 13 star is not logically equivalent to 16. Again, 16 is the first cause has no limits. To get to premise 16, we actually need an additional premise that there is a first cause. So it's pretty clear that 13 star and 16 are not logically equivalent. To think otherwise is simply mistaken.
Yeah, I agree, and that's why I didn't say that it's the contrapositive of 16. Rather, I said, and since this is quite literally the very thing Cameron's trying to prove, his argument from limits is begging the question. In other words, he's trying to prove that anything that does not have a cause is not limited, and the logical equivalent of one of his premises is anything that does not have a cause is not limited. Indeed, Cameron's ninth premise asserts that the first cause has no limits, and the first premise in his defense of this is literally the contrapositive. The logical equivalent of anything that is limited has a cause is anything that does not have a cause, such as a first cause, is not limited. That is begging the question, and the fact that Cameron's conclusion, premise 16, isn't equivalent to his ninth premise is not a feature, it's a bug. Remember, the only reason Cameron's argument from limits is on the table at all is as a defense of premise 9. If it doesn't substantiate premise 9, if the conclusion isn't effectively premise 9, then it's a red herring. Now, when defending his first premise, that there is a first cause, Cameron ensured that the conclusion of his argument was verbatim the first premise, which it should be. But when defending his ninth premise, that if there is a first cause then it has no limits, he didn't ensure that the conclusion of his argument is verbatim his ninth premise, which, again, it should be. Now, be it due to a fault of communication on my end, or a fault of not paying attention on Cameron's, my objection unfortunately has been completely ignored. And since this is the last word on this debate, this makes for a sour bite to end the meal. Or at least it does for me. With this, let's do all that we can. And move on.
But you might still be wondering, so why can my argument be replaced with different words? Isn't that kind of weird? Even if it's not begging the question via contraposition, there's something still clearly wrong with it, right? So while this doesn't show that my argument is question begging, I think it does show some of the limits of inductive reasoning.
The problem here is that Cameron's argument from limits isn't an inductive argument, it's a deductive argument. If the premises are true, if they're sound, then it's impossible for the conclusion to be false. That's an explicitly deductive feature, not inductive. If it really is the case that anything that is limited has a cause, and the first cause does not have a cause, then it's definitely the case that the first cause is not limited. Again, deductive, not inductive. Given this, the entirety of Cameron's connection from the first cause, the potentially infinitely many first causes, to God, or again, potentially infinitely many gods, is his argument from intuitive or inductive generalization, which he offers to defend premise 9 and premise 13, which isn't surprising since, again, they are logically equivalent.
But the person that's been tracking my arguments from the beginning knows that I didn't just give an argument from induction, I also gave an argument from rational intuition. In addition to our inductive experience of the world, I argue that limits seem like a relevant difference between the caused and the uncaused. Here's what I said. The second argument embedded in this clip, and actually in the rest of my opening statement, appeals to a widely shared rational intuition about the nature of limits. It kind of just seems obvious that limits have causes. My limited computer has a cause for its existence. My limited desk has a cause for its existence. Limits seem to be the kind of thing that have causes. Notice, however, that this intuition kind of weakens when we consider things that don't have limits. So intuitively, it does just kind of seem like limits are a relevant difference between the caused and uncaused. Notably, in his most recent response, Stephen did not address this argument at all. He didn't even mention it.
Except I did address this argument, Cameron. In fact, I've already addressed it twice. But since you missed it the second time, I'll play it again now. Likewise to Cameron's argument from limits, my argument from existence is valid. But unlike Cameron's argument, mine doesn't require you to assume the existence of something we have absolutely no examples of, the uncaused. As Cameron said himself,
absolutely nothing, like no object at all in our experience is uncaused.
Indeed, I can even employ the exact same inductive generalization as Cameron. That
part of the reason why we think that rocks and branches and people and cars and mountains have causes is because
they exist. Thus, and to bring Occam back into the swing, I would maintain that my argument from existence is objectively a better proposal than Cameron's argument from limit, since it makes less assumptions. Cameron's assumes the uncaused, whereas mine doesn't. Ironically enough, mine merely relies on the inductive generalization that Cameron's been defending throughout. To expand upon this issue further, note that since everything we experience has a cause, we can employ the same inductive generalization in relation to pretty much anything. So this, again, is the problem of Cameron's inductive generalization. Everything we have experience of is caused, and so his generalization applies to a boatload of attributes, with not the least of which being existence. To borrow Cameron's words, I could say the following. My existing computer has a cause for its existence. My existing desk has a cause for its existence. Existing things seem to be the kind of things that have causes. Notice, however, that this intuition kind of weakens when we consider things that don't exist, etc. It's true, everything we experience exists, and so we can employ precisely the same inductive generalization as Cameron to claim that the difference between the caused and the uncaused is existence. Now, I don't actually believe this to be the case, but I do believe that my argument from existence is an objectively better argument than Cameron's argument from limits, since mine makes less assumptions. And that's the point I've been expressing for many videos now. Finally, note that intuition is rightfully recognized as a notoriously awful way to get to the truth. The fact that the Earth is spherical isn't intuitive. The fact that we're orbiting a giant ball of fire isn't intuitive. The fact that we can get ill from microorganisms isn't intuitive. The fact that a feather and a rock will fall at the same speed in a vacuum isn't intuitive. General relativity isn't intuitive. And the quantum world, which, by the way, is where we have the strongest evidence of causation being very, very strange, is perhaps the most unintuitive facet in all of human knowledge. Intuition is not a good pathway to truth.
Guys, I'm totally joking around. Steven and I are not going to start punching each other when we see each other finally in person for the first time. I'm going to sucker punch him in the face. What's important here is not misrepresentation. What's important is that my additional argument from rational intuition is not open to parity. Parity with a T. Parity.
To the contrary, good sir. It's open to parity and parody. My argument from existence is, in fact, a parody of your argument from limits. And since you've twice now failed to address it, that is, you've repeated the claim that I failed to address your inductive generalization, this is unfortunately where we're going to have to tie the bow. And you know what? It does feel like a sucker punch. I would love to have made more headway here. But there is one more thing worth wrapping up before we finally conclude this epic debate. In his opening, Cameron didn't provide reason for why the first cause, or causes, are perfect, but in his first rebuttal, he did. At the time, we mutually agreed for me to forego focusing on them, but I think it's worth tackling them now. You know, to really dot the I's and cross the T's.
I gave 3 additional arguments that an unlimited thing has to be perfect. 1, imperfection implies limitation. 2, the argument from unlimited value. And then 3, the argument from unlimited power. Now, although Stephen hasn't responded to those 3 additional arguments in this debate, he said that he might address them in a later video. I'm actually hoping that he does because I think all of those are actually sound and good arguments.
Alright, let's deal with each in turn. Cameron's first argument for why an unlimited thing, or again things, must be perfect, consists of his argument from limits but with the first premise switched out for, get this, the contrapositive of perfect.
Now here is why reflecting on what's true about Keanu Reeves is important for this argument. What's true of Keanu Reeves seems to be true of every imperfect thing. Take any imperfect thing that you can think of, and you're going to be able to identify certain limitations that that thing has that account for its imperfection. So if imperfection implies limitation, as I've just argued with the Keanu Reeves example, then it follows by contraposition, that's actually a technical term, that an unlimited first cause is perfect.
Actually, Cameron, premise 13 star isn't the contrapositive of 16 star. But luckily it is the contrapositive of premise 10, which premise 16 star absolutely should be. So I'll again make the assumption that they're equivalent, as you do when it's in your favour. How's that for a sucker punch? Now, to be fair, Cameron didn't plug his reasoning into his argument from limits as I just have, but his reasoning did. He reasoned that since all of the cause things we experience are imperfect, such as Keanu Reeves,
what's true of Keanu Reeves seems to be true of every imperfect thing.
We can inductively generalize that uncaused things are perfect. However, as Cameron said himself, this is the contrapositive of his premise 10, and so it's begging the question.
Then it follows by contraposition, that's actually a technical term.
What's more, note again that his inductive generalization on perfection suffers all of the same issues I levied at his inductive generalization on limits. It's effectively the same argument, and so it receives the same objections. So, let's move on to his second argument.
My second argument moves from some degree of value to unlimited value to God. Different things exemplify different degrees of value. For example, my house is pretty valuable, but it's not as valuable as my daughter. It's pretty plausible that the first cause has some non-zero degree of value. After all, it's the ground or source of everything else that does have value. Now let's apply my argument from limits. If the first cause has some non-zero degree of value, then by the argument from limits, it has an unlimited degree of value.
This is again, in a nutshell, the same as his first argument. Cameron is plugging in the opposite of the attributes and qualities he wants the first cause or first causes to have, just as I, by parity with a D, have plugged in attributes and qualities I know Cameron doesn't want the first cause or first causes to have. For instance, by plugging in the inductive generalization that anything that is valuable has a cause, we get the conclusion that the first cause is invaluable, and not in a good way.
My third argument moves from some degree of power to unlimited power to God. It's pretty plausible that the first cause has some non-zero degree of power. Something isn't really a cause unless it has the power to cause things, right? But now let's apply my argument from limits. If the first cause has some non-zero degree of power, then by the argument from limits, it follows that the first cause is unlimited in power. Another way of putting this is that the first cause is omnipotent.
Again, this is a contraposition through a faulty inductive generalization. Thus, all three of Cameron's defenses of premise 10 fail for precisely the same reason as his defense of premise 9. Alrighty, so Cameron concluded by preaching about how God is awesome and that he loves us all, etc. But I'm going to take a different tone. Whether you are a theist or an atheist, convinced by Cam's Kalaam or not, I just want to sincerely thank you for the time you've invested into this debate. Yes, me and Cameron have worked hard, but without an audience that's interested in the ideas we're discussing, it's all for naught. So thank you, kindly, for the view. Likewise, I'd like to extend my utmost gratitude to Cameron and all of his team, who have no doubt encouraged me, and I'm sure many others, to learn more about this finite or indeed infinite world that we are all so fortunate to be a part of. And last but not least, I'd like to thank my patrons, who without I simply would not be able to invest such time and energy into projects like this. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for your support.